I told a story last winter, having returned from Oklahoma City in our mission trip of last February. I think it bears repeating today on the story of feeding the 5,000. And as we have 13 of our members who are in New Orleans, probably as we speak or very near, we got a text at about 7:15 from Dave Dringenberg saying that they were having breakfast in Louisiana. So they're probably pulling into Pastor Keene's church there, a Lutheran church that we worship at when we get to New Orleans, and it's kind of a home base for us in serving in the rebuilding that continues after Hurricane Katrina 10 years ago, the anniversary. When we got back when we were in Oklahoma City last year, we were helping a family that had lost everything in the tornado from May of 2013. And we had spent about an hour with the dad, the homeowner, as we were showing him a project that people had been working on before we came, and we were going to try to do a similar project in his yard, and we wanted him to see what it was like and tell us if that seemed like a good project. He was really excited about it, and spending time with him, it gave us a chance to hear his story. He told us about a harrowing escape the day that they announced during a program that was going on at school that all the families should just gather and leave as soon as possible, and how they'd thrown as many belongings as they could into one car and left their good car in the garage because they didn't want it to get damaged by the storm, and how they'd escaped. And we're thankful a day later to be safe and sound, because when they returned to their home and their neighborhood, everything was destroyed. They lost everything. That car they wanted to be safe had been blown by the tornado 100 yards down the street out of a shattered garage. He said, "Thankfully, I have some insurance, but it can't begin to replace, everything you own. You don't realize what that is until you lose it all." And that's when he teared up. And this guy hadn't said anything about God or faith or church, but he teared up at that point when he said, the rebuilding is so hard. Because he said, that's when you people started coming. And you kept coming, he said. Hundreds of you. For weeks and now months, you people kept coming. He was talking about all the groups that had been helping since the tornado in rebuilding. I want us to think about this story. We've been looking at stories that happen in events in the life of Jesus that show us the experience of God that's illuminated through Jesus. And in this story of the feeding of the 5,000, I want us to realize that if you fill in the blanks, that those who were fed were the learners. Now, we call them disciples, but those who were fed were the learners. I don't know if you're filling in the blanks to help with concentration and following along. Somebody said, yeah, it helps me. And sometimes when I fill in the blanks, I know before you get there what you're going to say. And someone else said, yeah, and sometimes I have a better idea than you had. So that's good. That sermon turned out even better. I'm not sure what motivated you and coming today? Maybe there is a sense in your life of wanting to be fed, of needing encouragement, needing hope. God feeds people, not just literally the 5,000. God feeds people out of the needs that we bring. But I want you to know that what God was especially doing, what Jesus was especially doing on that day, was feeding his learners, his disciples. And that can include us when we express something as simple as, God, I want to make a difference for you in my life. I want to be one of your followers. And that's the power of what happens in this story, is that Jesus feeds those learners, those disciples among us. Here's how this story unfolded. If you go into the 14th chapter of Matthew, you'll see for yourself that the story began with the sad news that had reached Jesus that John the Baptist had been beheaded. A gruesome execution then and now. John the Baptist, the one person who knew who Jesus really was. Remember when we started this path of the stories in the life of Jesus? It began with John the Baptist, the one who really knew who Jesus was. And Jesus, no doubt, had this sense, this is the one guy who gets me, my cousin. Gets me. He understands the immense purpose of my life. And John has been executed by King Herod. And it says in the Bible that hearing that news, Jesus left for a deserted place. We can only assume that Jesus wanted to get away, that he was grieving. And it says he went to a deserted place to be alone. But the people saw him and they followed him. The crowds that we've been observing, who had been coming for the baptism, the crowds who had gathered for his first sermon that we've been hearing about the last 2 Sundays, when he looked out with compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd, that same crowd, and he looked on those, and his words fell on the poor and the sad, and those hungering hungering and thirsting for justice and righteousness. And those words, like we heard last Sunday, we plowed through the snow. He taught them to pray. And it was the same crowds that followed him. Even though Jesus was at a point where he wanted to be alone and needed to collect himself, they followed, and when Jesus saw that the crowds had followed, his heart was again moved, the Bible says, and it says he healed their sick and taught them many things. Now, this is where the story helps us realize this main point that I want to make today, that those who were fed were the learners. Because notice what happens as the crowds are there. The disciples, the learners who, you see again and again in the Bible, they kind of think they're Jesus' advisors. They kind of think they need to tell Jesus what the next step should be. I don't know if you ever get in that position in your life where you kind of think you've got an idea, God, about how this is supposed to go. And here's what needs to happen. Jesus, these crowds are here. They need to go and get something to eat. It's been a long time. And, somebody said to me this morning, these people would have brought their lunch. I don't know. When I see these crowds and I see them described in the Bible, and I see Jesus' heart being turned over with compassion because they're like sheep without a shepherd, speaking to the poor, the sad, the broken. I see people wandering in desperation. I don't see people with a lot. I see the people 10 years ago at the Superdome when the floods hit New Orleans and the tornado and the hurricane. I see those people in that desperate state who had nowhere to go and no transportation and no one to go to. These are the kind of people I think were there in the crowd. And the disciples were mindful they need to get back to wherever they came from because there's nothing out here for them. And they're hungry. And that's when this interaction begins, where we see that Jesus is talking to the disciples. He's feeding the learners. They say, Jesus, they got to go away. And Jesus says to them, you give them something to eat. And that's when the disciples say to Jesus, we have nothing save 5 loaves and 2 fish. And that's when Jesus says, bring them here to me. The point of learning for learners in Jesus today is the disciples saying, in effect, we got nothing. And Jesus telling them, bring your nothing to me. Now, this is why this word is for this great movement of followers. Here we find a wellspring of compassion that flows from God, who creates out of nothing life itself, and moves in the midst of our nothing to create a wellspring of compassion. Here's where we see the movement in the words of that man in Oklahoma City last year who said, you people keep coming. It's a great movement of food and health care and teaching and shelter and listening and care in ways we can't begin to fathom. But of course it's not us. It's Jesus who takes our nothing and makes something of it. So wherever we are in our journey, and if we realize we have a role to fulfill in this life we've been given, that role might seem kind of simple and common, a student, a parent, a grandparent. It's a role we might have in our job. Might not feel like a really important job, or maybe it does, but somewhere along the line, we realize that somebody's looking to us for something. And maybe it's possible that some of us in a position of wanting to follow God have been at that point where we say, I got nothing. I'm tired. I'm empty. I'm depleted. I just feel like, giving up. Retiring and going away. I got nothing. But Jesus says, give your nothing to me. I can make something out of nothing. Now, there's a couple illustrations that I wanted to share that I think guide us along the path of this journey in a practical kind of a way. We, ever since we moved into this building 7 years ago, it'll be 7 years, I guess, next fall, we were really thankful to have been able to get from a facility that in many ways just was not adequate for us into a facility that we took a stretch, and I was reminded yesterday at a stewardship conference that we technically stretched further financially than we probably should have, but thank God for the movement and the generous hearts that continue to fund our ministry plan and allow us to have this space. It's a stretch, but we're doing it. And, way to go, everybody. But one thing that was real right from the get-go, very quickly, even with this new space, it didn't take very long before most Sundays at 9:15, at least some of our classrooms were at or beyond capacity with kids. Some Sundays, a whole lot of classrooms are at or beyond capacity. Not just on this end with the pre's to the K-5, but when you talk about our middle school and high school ministries. And you wonder, what are we going to do that when we feel full? Obvious solution people would think of, well, we got to build more space. But of course, more space for what we would need would be another $1 million. Can't do that. Of course, we realize that we can use our heads and say, we can multiply so that we're not thinking that all of our learning time has to happen on 1 hour each week. What if we were to double Sunday school at 10:45, knowing that some families might actually say, that's kind of nice. I don't have to push my kids out early Sunday morning, and I can still get the same good experience of worship and education at a later hour. We've known that we needed to try to stretch to do this for years, and we are bound and determined this fall that we're going to get started with preschool through at least first or second grade. And a lot of people say, now how in the world are you going to pull that off? How do you know you're going to have enough families that will commit to that hour of education so that when new people show up, they have a kind of critical mass of attendees? I mean, one of the things we know is that people love to come to a church and say, wow, they got lots of kids. And how are we going to make sure that we're going to have that at 10:45? How are we going to make sure that we have enough support people in those classrooms to work with those kids? How are we going to make sure that we got enough teachers so that the support people have someone to support? How are we going to make sure that we got somebody that can coordinate all that? And there's a whole lot of reasons. That's why it's taken us years to get this ball rolling. Because we say, look, we got nothing. And yet, we're going to do it. Because of what happens in the lives of these kids. We saw just a glimpse of it in that video this morning, when little children begin to be able to tell you the story of Jesus. And their lives are changed forever. And there's people, I know there's going to be people with a vision for saying, we are not going to seal this ministry's participation of children. We're going to find a way to multiply. We're going to take one for the team so that when new people come through those doors, they don't have to feel like there's not enough space for my kids. Give your nothing to me, Jesus said. Second illustration is from the story of the church that I had the deep honor of planting for 15 years in inner city Milwaukee, All People's Church. All People's has announced a campaign called the Harambe Kitchen at All People's Church. The Harambe Kitchen, that Harambe is an African Swahili word that means the people pull together. The neighborhood where All People's is located is called the Harambe Kitchen. And that ministry that exists there is one that helps us think about where the neighborhood people can go for food. Now, there was a church next door called St. Gall's Catholic Church that closed about 15 years ago. St. Vincent de Paul moved in and began to provide a meal program there. And for many years, and I saw them, there's a half a block from All People's, 200 to 500 men, women, and children would come to be fed a hot meal. And then they lost the building. I'm not sure what the diocese has done with that property, but it's no longer available. St. Vincent de Paul came to the Lutherans at All People's a half block away and said, would you be willing to house this meal? Pastor Steve said, yes, we will. And then I was just blown away when I heard that it's going to cost $350,000. I called Pastor Steve. I said, how is this going to fit with your mission? I mean, yeah, of course God wants us to feed hungry people, but All People's Church has always been a church, not just a place for people to get things. It's always been a place where discipleship is happening, Bible study and the raising up of people as followers. And how are you going to do all that with a meal program 5 nights a week and raise $350,000 to do it? He said, that's the beautiful thing of this whole plan. St. Vincent de Paul is going to keep providing the meal, and All People's Church is going to surround those men, women, and children during the week with Bible study, with recovery programs, with employment assistance, with children's and youth ministry. When they come for food, the church is going to do what the church does. And then I thought to myself, you're going to be able to feed 200 to 500 hungry people. And mind you, these are the kind of folks, if you have a memory of the souls that gathered around the Superdome when the waters were rising because they had nowhere else to go. These are the souls in Milwaukee. People that are in difficult living situations are the souls that God gave me the privilege of raising up a church with. And I thought, you're going to be able to feed 200 to 500 of them every weeknight and surround them with Bible study and children and youth programming and recovery ministry and employment assistance. And you can do all that for a one-time cost of $350,000. That's cheap. And then Steve said, that's not even the good news. We have all but $60,000 committed or given. Now, it's quite possible we could say, I got nothing. But Jesus says, give your nothing to me and watch a miracle happen. I'm not sure where you are today, where you're needing a filling. But God is inviting us to lay our lives in His hands and to realize if we're at our wits' end or given up or spent, we think we got nothing to give our nothing to God. Give our nothing to Jesus and make something beautiful for God.